All right, welcome back. So today the Vancouver Canucks have signed Thatcher Demko to a 5-year contract extension at $5 million per season. And it is a remarkable contract. It's a good contract, I think. Obviously for Demko, it's his first year as a starter, so there's some risk there. But it's a risk I'm okay with because Demko's looked pretty good this year, and of course in the playoffs last year, he had a nice little couple of games there against Vegas before everything was all said and done. But it's remarkable because Vancouver has throughout their history had a hard time developing a goaltender they've drafted to become a starter in the NHL. So this board of madness contains the name of every goaltender who's played 15 or more games in any given season for Vancouver. And it's also got every goaltender they've ever drafted on this side of the board. And then we've got homegrown wins here, which is a short list. So 70-71, their first year in the NHL. Obviously, there's not going to be a goalie they drafted who plays for them that year. It's Charlie Hodge, Dunk Wilson, and George Gardner. 71-72, Dunk Wilson and George Gardner met the minimum. The minimum I use is 15 games or more. Only because if you have like one or more games, there could be a lot of goaltenders on this board, especially when you get into the late 90s. 72-73, Dunk Wilson and Ed Dick are on the board. Now, Ed, you'll notice, has an asterisk next to his name there, and that's because he is the first drafted goaltender for the Vancouver Canucks who played 15 or more games in a season. 73-74, only Gary Smith makes the requirement of 15 games. Played a ton. 74-75, it's Gary Smith and Ken Lockett. 75-76, it's Smith and Lockett again. 76-77, Cesar Maniago is the guy who played the most games, and Kurt Ridley was the backup, and it's the same duo the following season. 78-79, Gary Bromley gets the most games played that year. Glenn Hanlon second and Dunk Wilson third. Glenn Hanlon, asterisk next to his name, because he was drafted by the Canucks as well. And when they got rid of him, it was a move that I, as a kid, wasn't all that happy about. 79-80, Glenn Hanlon's the starter. Gary Bromley's the backup. But then in 80-81, Vancouver adds Richard Brodeur from the New York Islanders. The Islanders don't need Brodeur. They've got Melanson. They've got Smith. They don't need Brodeur, so they trade him. And Brodeur plays the most games with Bromley second and Hanlon third. 81-82, Brodeur clearly the starter. Hanlon clearly the backup. And then Hanlon would move on to St. Louis. And yeah, I mean, I understood why they went with Brodeur, but man, it wasn't a trade that aged all that well, I thought. I thought Hanlon was the better of the two goaltenders. 82-83, it's Richard Brodeur and John Garrett. John Garrett, of course, not homegrown, not drafted by the Vancouver Canucks, clearly. Although his name is associated with Vancouver quite a bit because of all the announcing he's done for the Canucks. 83-84, it's Richard Brodeur, John Garrett, and Frank Caprice. Caprice, a Canucks draft pick as well. But you'll notice, Glenn Hanlon, Ed Dick, Frank Caprice. So far, one of them becomes a starter, but not for the Canucks. He ends up moving on to become a starter somewhere else. 84-85, it's Richard Brodeur and Frank Caprice. 85-86, it's Richard Brodeur and Wendell Young. Wendell Young, a Canucks draft pick, who I was like, cool, a Canucks draft pick. Here we go, is another new... Nope, he ends up going to Pittsburgh. 86-87, it's Richard Brodeur and Frank Caprice. 87-88, Kirk McLean joins the team from New Jersey. He becomes the starter. Frank Caprice is the backup. 88-89, Kirk McLean and Steve Weeks are the goaltenders. They remained the tandem 89-90, and that's where the Canucks really had, I thought 89-90, that was probably the best tandem I'd seen the Canucks have. Where, Weeks' numbers weren't necessarily as good as McLean's, but I thought they were both solid goalies. 90-91, Troy Gamble actually played the most games, and Kirk McLean right there with him. What was interesting was Troy Gamble, a draft pick of the Canucks, relatively early draft pick, highly thought of prospect, and he was very good when he first came into the league. And then concussions, a freakish number of concussions over a short period hit him, and he never really truly recovered. 91-92, Kirk McLean's the starter. Troy Gamble played, I think it was 19 games that year. Didn't look great, but again, it felt like it was all the concussions caught up with him. And it wasn't that he was a bust, it was just, it happens. Some players, it's just that's how it works. 92-93, they get Kay Whitmore as the backup to Kirk McLean. They liked that so much that 93-94 they kept him. And, of course, they brought in John Van Beesbrook with the idea that Van Beesbrook would get drafted by Florida, and then they could keep Kay Whitmore. And Kay Whitmore was likely to go to Anaheim if they'd had the first draft pick in net. But Florida had the first draft pick in that, and they took Van Beesbrook. So Kay Whitmore stayed for 94-95 as the backup to Kirk McLean. McLean was the starter as well the following season, 95-96, with Corey Hirsch as the backup. Now, Hirsch, of course, started out with the Rangers. Hirsch stayed on as the backup for 96-97. 97-98, Arturs Urbe played the most games for the Canucks that year, and he was great. And they rewarded him by getting rid of him. I still don't understand. Kirk McLean played the second most games that year. Sean Burke was number 3, and of course that was where Kirk McLean was leaving, exits the team that season. 98-99, Garth Snow was the starter. Corey Hirsch was the backup. Garth Snow, I believe, was team MVP that year as well, because that was a rough year, and just the fact that he never gave up was something. 99-2000, and Garth Snow was pretty good that year, and it was really, comparatively speaking, with the rest of the team. 99-2000, Felix Potvin played the most games. Garth Snow second most, and Kevin Weeks third. And Kevin Weeks, of course, came in, and the Canucks said he was the goalie of the future, even though he hadn't won a game yet. And then he won some games the following season, and they rewarded him by trading him because the whole thing was just weird. 2000-2001, Bob Essenza played the most games for the Canucks that year. Felix Potvin second, and Dan Cloutier came in. So this is your goalie graveyard situation that it felt like was created under Brian Burke's era and disappeared when Burke did. So, yeah. And then 01-02, it was Dan Cloutier and Peter Skudra. That was also the tandem the following season, 2002-2003. And then 2003-2004, Johan Hedberg was the backup. I thought Hedberg did a really good job as well. They didn't keep him around, though. 05-06, Alex Auld was the only one who played enough games to get on the board. Auld was played into the ground, and then they traded him to Florida. And in 06-07, they played Roberto Luongo into the ground with 76 games played that year. 07-08, Roberto Luongo, Curtis Sanford became the backup. 08-09, Roberto Luongo, Curtis Sanford again. 2009-2010, and I still think they brought in Sanford because they were tired of the Blues beating them with Sanford in net. 2009-2010, it was Luongo and Raycroft. Raycroft, one of those magical, that's a Raycroft picture right there with Boston. He also played for Dallas. He played for Vancouver. He played for all three, the holy trinity of the teams I cheer for. So yeah, Raycroft's one of those unusual ones. So did Auld, though, too. 2010-2011, Roberto Luongo and Corey Schneider. And there's the first asterisk you've seen on this board since the 85-86 season. It takes a very long time before another goaltender the Canucks drafted ends up on this board. And then it's Luongo and Schneider in 2011-2012, right? 2012-2013, Schneider takes over. He's the starter. Luongo's the backup. And then they traded Schneider because my theory was always that they hated their own fans. 2013-2014, oh, you like this guy? Well, he's gone. Now what are you going to do? So 2013-2014 was the just disastrous season where Luongo, they have to go, and Tortorella has to go and come back, we want you. And then he benched him for the outdoor game against Ottawa in favor of Eddie Lack. Now you'll see Lack there has 2 stars. Why? The Canucks never drafted him. But I'm giving them credit for the fact that they signed him as a free agent and they brought him over. So he wasn't drafted by the Canucks, but they found him. And then Luongo leaves at the end of 2013, well, during the 2013-2014 season, and then Markstrom was brought in. He doesn't get enough games to get on the board. 2014-2015, in order to replace Luongo, they bring in Ryan Miller, with Eddie Lack playing the backup role. Famously, Lack ends up being traded out, even though Canuck fans really wanted to keep him around. 2015-2016, Miller and Backstrom are the goaltenders. And Backstrom's very slowly growing into his role as a starter. It kind of felt like Florida gave up on him. That's part of the reason why he was sent to Vancouver. That's how it felt. I'm not saying it's necessarily what it was. But that's how it felt at the time, right? 2016-2017 is still Ryan Miller and Jacob Markstrom. And Ryan Miller, and the amount of just awful games that the defense was having in front of him, and the fact that he still always gave his best all 60 minutes of the game, remarkable to see, and that's the reason why I am still a Ryan Miller fan to this day. 2017-2018, Jacob Markstrom and Anders Nilsson were the goaltenders. And it was, okay, so these guys are friends from Sweden, and that's done already, huh? Nilsson's gone, okay. 2018-2019, Jacob Markstrom, the only one that qualifies to be on the board. 2019-2020, Jacob Markstrom, and there's Thatcher Demko. There's another asterisk. And it's 9 years after Schneider. And I had some fear on some level. I'm like, okay, so Corey Schneider comes out, right? And as soon as he's good enough to be the starter, he ends up in New Jersey. Does pretty well there to start out, and I know it didn't end well, but he did pretty well there the first few years. That's why he got that huge contract. And so I was concerned. I was like, okay, so could we see the same thing again, where Luongo was the starter, right? Still playing very well. Schneider comes up and ends up being the guy who gets traded. Could we have seen a situation where Markstrom is the starter and Demko's playing really well, but ends up being the one that gets traded? He's got more market value, whatever it is. The Canucks are like, we're going to stick with the veteran. So Markstrom, coming out of that season, when it became apparent he wanted to sign only a contract with a no movement clause, the Canucks had a choice to make. And Benning, and I'm on Team Fire Benning for most things this year, for the way most things have gone. I am absolutely right there. But the decision to let Markstrom go and keep Demko today makes a heck of a lot of sense. You have Demko now at $1 million less than the Flames are paying Markstrom. From what I understand, there's no trade or no movement clause involved. And you've locked up your number one goaltender for 5 years beyond this one. So your goaltending is now more stable than it's probably ever been. The Kirk McLean era was very good at the start. By the time it ended, McLean as a starting goaltender was middling to lower 10 in the NHL. Roberto Luongo was an excellent goaltender, but it all became a huge distraction that last year that he was in Vancouver. Miller was very good, but it was a 3-year period where he was the starter, and there wasn't any long-term plan while he was here. I kind of felt bad for him, to be honest. And of course, Richard Brodeur in the 80s. Great goaltender, but I think he was kind of a Cam Ward-esque career in that, you know, for Vancouver, he had godlike status for that 1982 run to the Stanley Cup. And honestly, totally understand it. I was right there. I was a huge Richard Brodeur fan as a kid. But did that mean that the Canucks sometimes maybe overrated him? Probably. And that has tended to happen over the years. But yeah, we went from the Brodeur era to Kirk McLean. And then you have this. Then you have the Dan Cloutier era, which of course led to playoff failures. And the question I've always had, we'll never know the answer. If you take the 02-03 Vancouver Canucks and you put Luongo, as he had played in Florida on that team, do they win a Stanley Cup that year? I think they probably do. But again, we'll never know. And this year, Thatcher Demko and Braden Holtby are the goaltenders on the board. So when you look at their draft record, it's poor. So let's just go through it. And I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible. There's a lot of names on here. 1970, number 30 overall spot, they draft Ed Dick, 49 games played, 8-28-8 record, 861 save percentage. In 1972, at 83rd overall, they draft Dave McClelland, plays 2 games. He's 1-1 with an 857 save percentage. So those guys both played for the Canucks. 1973, they draft Clay Habenton, doesn't play a game. 1975, they draft Normand Lapointe, no NHL games. 1977, they drafted 2 NHL-level goaltenders. Glenn Hanlon, who played 477 games in the NHL, 167 wins, 202 losses, 61 ties, 885 save percentage. They also drafted Murray Bannerman that year at 58. Plays 289 games, 116 wins, 125 losses, 33 ties, 880 save percentage. He'd go on to have some success in Chicago. 1978, they draft Rick Martins, no NHL games. 1979, Ken Ellicott, drafted 47th overall, played 2 games, had a record of 2-3-4, 867 save percentage. 1980, they draft Daryl May. 1981, they draft Wendell Young and Frank Caprice in the same draft. They both end up on the board. 1982, they draft Sean Kilroy. 1984, they draft Rex Grant. 1985, that's Troy Gamble. They draft 25th overall. So he was drafted high, and they had high hopes for him, and then the concussions take him out. Matt Merton was drafted in 1986. 1987, they draft Todd Fanning and John Fletcher, were 2 goaltenders they drafted. 1988, they draft Corey D'Alessio, who ends up playing I think he had a game in Vancouver, not very much. At 1989, they draft Gus Morchauser, which sadly he didn't end up playing. 1991, they draft Jason Fitzsimmons. 1992, number 45 overall, they draft Mike Fountain. And there was a lot of talk about how Mike Fountain played like Kirk McLean. They had a similar physical stature, and this was going to be the goalie. Remember, this is 92, so this is right when the Canucks are getting good. And the idea was that by maybe 95, he'll be ready to be the starter. It just never happened. Sonny Mignacca was drafted that year as well. 1993, they draft Dieter Koken, who of course would play for Tampa, and he didn't really play for Vancouver. Sergei Kachenko was drafted as well that year. 1995, they draft Jason Kugnett. No idea. Or Sugnet, I guess. 1996, they drafted Nolan McDonald, 147th overall. 1997, they draft two of them, Matt Cockle and Peter Brady. It's one of the Bradys, isn't it? One of the Bradys, right? Sure. All right. This sounds good. Sure. 1999, they drafted Kevin Swanson, 189th overall. 2002, 83rd overall, they draft Lucas Mensader. Great name. Absolutely fantastic name. Rob McVicker and Matt Violin were drafted as well that year. So they went with three goaltenders. 2004, 26th overall. So one spot later than where they drafted Troy Gamble. They drafted Corey Schneider. And then they also drafted Julian Ellis that year. 2005, they drafted Alexander Vincent. 2008, they draft Morgan Clark. 2009, they draft Joe Canada. 2010, they drafted Jonathan E. Laddie. Right? 2011, they drafted David Honzik. 2014, 36th overall, they drafted Thatcher Demko. So, not too shabby, 36th overall. I think if you did a redraft now, he goes higher than that. 2017, drafted 64th overall, Michael DiPietro. And as soon as next season, he could be the backup. The Canucks, starting next season, should have a cheap goaltending tandem, because I don't think Holtby's still here next year, and I don't know how that works, but I don't think Holtby stays for next season. Matthew Thiessen was drafted in 2018, and then in 2019, they draft Arturs Silovs. So that's a lot of goalies drafted by the Canucks. Not a lot of stars in amongst the goaltenders have been drafted. So homegrown wins. Who's got the most homegrown wins? Corey Schneider with 55. Among the goaltenders that they've drafted or that they've signed before they played anywhere else, Schneider's got 55. Glenn Hanlon, 43 with the Canucks. Eddie Lack, 34. Frank Caprice, 31. Demko has 30. Demko is a good season away from being the all-time leader in homegrown wins among the Vancouver Canucks. This is why today is historic and it deserved its own video. Troy Gamble, 22 wins. Ed Dick, 8. Wendell Young, 5. Mike Fountain had 2. Ken Ellicott, 2. McClelland had 1. Your all-time leaders in wins, just to look at where Demko is with 30, he's got a ways to go. Luongo has 252. That's a solid number one spot. McLean, 211. But they're the only goaltenders with 200 wins in Vancouver history. Richard Brodeur, still there with 126 at 3rd overall. And Dan Cloutier with 109, 4th overall. Jacob Markstrom, he left Vancouver with 99 career wins as a Canucks goaltender because he can't have nice things. So think about those losses the Canucks take where Markstrom probably should have had the win, and just one of those, it turned out right, he would have had even 100 wins. Which means that for Demko to end up on this list, he's probably about 3 years away from it. And I'm saying that as like, at most, 3 years away from being on that list. Because he needs 69 wins to get there. There's still some games left here. And of course, it should be back to 82 game seasons next year. I believe in Demko. If I didn't, I wouldn't have got a Demko jersey last summer when Cool Hockey had their sale. I think that this is the first time that the Canucks have ever had a homegrown goaltender that they've handed the reins to. Schneider was supposed to be that first, and then they traded him. Bo Horvat's excellent. No complaints about getting Bo Horvat in that deal. Though at the time, there may have been some complaining, some swearing, and throwing things. But now, there isn't. Because, yeah, Horvat's pretty good. He's captain and all that. And Demko has definitely made all that feel better. But there you go. It's a remarkable goaltending history for the Vancouver Canucks. There's a lot of names on it. But again, what's remarkable about this day today, the Canucks drafted a goaltender, they turned him into a starter, and now he's signing a long-term deal in Vancouver. That is legit. Never happened in 51 seasons that the Vancouver Canucks have been in the NHL. That's remarkable. And there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.